Welcome to JLab, a podcast from the Civic Journalism Lab, a forum for professional, student and community journalists in the northeast of England to meet, learn and collaborate. It's supported by Newcastle University and by BBC North East and Cumbria. My name is Ian Wiley, and the focus of this podcast episode is the intersection between technology and journalism. And we'll be hearing the thoughts and experiences of Paul Gallagher, who is Digital Innovations Editor at Reach plc, formerly Trinity Mirror and the UK's largest news publisher. I think it's fair to say that for much of the last 20 years, technology has been viewed with suspicion, maybe even as the enemy by journalists who didn't like seeing their traditional methods and business models disrupted, even destroyed. But perhaps we're entering a new phase now, where we're beginning to see technology as an enabler that can not only help us solve problems like combating the scourge of fake news, but perhaps empower us to do even better journalism. So let's listen to what Paul has to share about how his news organisation is using technology to reach more people with better storytelling.
The sort of intersection of technology and journalism is something that I've always been interested in. My background is I actually was a computer programmer for a couple of years before I retrained as a journalist, and then I was a print journalist working for newspapers, national and regional newspapers. But for the last 10 years, I've really specialised in digital journalism, and specifically for regional titles, and working at the Manchester Evening News predominantly. I'm based in Manchester, where I was head of online. And then the last 5 years, I've almost had what for me is a dream job. It's I'm working. My job title, as Ian said, is Digital Innovations Editor, and I work across the entire group. So I'm not just based in Manchester, work across all our newsrooms, and I get to really do the fun stuff. So I get to try out new gadgets, testing new technology, and looking at ways that we can sustain and grow local journalism in a digital world. So I'm going to talk a bit about that, really, some of the things that we've been trying out, both at the Manchester Evening News and the titles that Reach runs. And as Ian says, they're everywhere. The Newcastle Chronicle is part of Reach. Plenty of titles in the North East, in Hull, Teesside, Grimsby, and then right across the country. So Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol, Cardiff, and Leeds, and we're also in Scotland and Ireland. So newsrooms everywhere, hundreds of journalists, and they're all trying to find new ways of telling stories. And so as my job is to help them with that. So I've got some slides. And I'll talk about over them. So yeah, first of all, I think the point Ian made about technology disrupting journalism, I suppose the biggest disruption has been the mobile device, and the changes in the platforms that people consume journalism, and that hasn't just changed the publication and the consumption of journalism, but also storytelling and news gathering. And really, we've been living with that for 10 years, and it's still playing out. But I think there's a second wave of disruption that comes from everybody consuming journalism on digital devices, and that is that we know far more about the audience than we ever did in print. And that sort of a mountain of information about the audience is also changing journalism now, and it's changing the newsrooms, changing career structures. But I think, as Ian said, it is also beginning to point to a way that we can build a sustainable future for regional journalism in the digital world. So I'll come to that at the end. So run through some of the different ways that we're telling stories on our regional sites on digital. And that's obviously one of the key advantages we've got is that we're not limited anymore to telling a story with a one picture and 300 words like we are in a newspaper. And there are lots of ways that we can tell stories in more immersive and interactive ways. And I've got a couple of examples here. Hopefully these will work, but these are very close to home. So when it was the millionth runner of the Great North Run, instead of doing it in the usual way, the the Chronicle were able to really make that story come to life. We use a platform called Shorthand to tell stories immersively, and using scrolling reveals to tell a story. So you can see that people will scroll, and you can start to tell the story of the Great North Run in a way that you just couldn't have done before. There's some really nice features in Shorthand, so you can have, the story goes on, but you can have sort of video titles. This one's really nice, so as you're reading the story, the people run past, make the story come to life with graphics. And there's that gives us a way of telling stories that we could never do before. And similarly with data, telling stories about big issues using data. Instead of using stats, the Chronicle can now use in-house built digital platforms to tell stories in more engaging ways. So the gender inequality in Newcastle, an investigation into that was able to, the journalists were able to really bring that to life by using a scrolling interactive storytelling platform. Now eventually the data will show you, so instead of having graphs, you can show what those people look like, what that stat looks like in numbers. So if Newcastle was however many people, that's what the gender divide looks like. These are what the qualifications in different gender roles. And so digital gives us that opportunity to really engage audiences around an important story. We can also use lots of other techniques like 360 degrees cameras. I'll try and launch this article. Hopefully it will launch quickly. But this was an article we did for the Manchester Evening News, just using a phone and the Street View app to tell a story about a derelict building that was being brought to life as a new food and drink destination. But being able to allow people to explore the story and explore the building is something that we can now do and really engage audiences. So I don't know if there's any sound on here, but so Nick Johnson.
You get to see from outside. It's something behind you walk through the door.
So this Nick Johnson has renovated this building, but at the time it hadn't been renovated. So allowing people to explore the area, but also go in and have a look round.
Okay, so it's got time now you walk through the door into the central space, which probably might take time. It is about 20 metres from the ground floor. So because it sits inboard, the room sits inboard of the side of the building.
So you get the idea. So these are ways that we can allow people, instead of us telling a story, as I say, in text and images, allow people to go in and explore and find the things that are interesting to them in the journalism. And that was done just with a phone. There was no 360-degree cameras used in that. That was just done with an iPhone and Street View app. But we have been looking at using 360-degree cameras to tell stories in other ways, and we did buy a load of cameras that we could attach to the phones. We did a project around the election, so we filmed a lot of the election counts, and I think this was quite interesting because it did show you, it showed us, it was able to show the audience the extent to which things are stage managed, particularly in politics. So where you have a person standing there, you have the politicians getting the results at the end of the election, and all the cameras are pointing the same direction. You do that with a 360-degree camera, people can see the people behind the scenes, the party officials with the clipboards, and how everything's is basically staged, and give people that full picture. So that was a really interesting way to tell the story of the election, the last election. And then again, these, I think in many cases 360-degree pictures or videos may seem like gimmicks, but sometimes they are almost the most powerful way to tell a story. I don't know whether this will work. It might check with a launch into. Yeah, it will. Okay, so after the arena attack in Manchester, there was this astonishing floral tribute that built up in the city centre, and by just doing a 360-degree image of that, posting that natively on Facebook, it was the most effective way for people to see what was going on, to capture what was going on there. And that image reached 3 million people on the Manchester Evening News Facebook. So it was a really sort of like effective way of telling that story. I think we're increasingly seeing the cameras, as well as capturing 360 degree, that we can tell stories. Obviously, you can put a camera more or less anywhere, and we can tell stories by putting cameras into the places where the stories are happening. Whether that could be a drone, in the case of the top left there, which is we did a drone picture of a festival site. You can use dash cam footage. I just saw this one on the Chronicle website today, which is using police police body cam footage, so you can, when that's being released. But one experiment we did do, which was quite interesting, was what would it be like if you could put a camera on a reporter? If a reporter could wear a camera, and we used Google Glass, which we got a sort of a development model of Google Glass at the time that it was launched. Now, obviously, Google Glass got a bit of bad press, but we did do quite an interesting experiment using it that showed that there is potential for a wearable camera on a journalist to tell stories in a different way. One of the ways it worked quite well was the Manchester City launched a hospitality box which costs £25,000 for one game. So these are probably the most expensive seats in football, and our journalists were invited to go along. And she wore the Google Glass camera, and so she was able to capture the moment when you walk through the door and you're offered a glass of champagne, and you can probably just about see there's a Premier League trophy in the background there. That's the real Premier League trophy in your hospitality box. And of course, what everyone wants to know, if you're paying £25,000 for a watch a football match, is what's the buffet like? What's the food like? And so she walked along the buffet and talked about what was on offer, and then walked out into the stadium. So that could have been done with holding a camera. Obviously, it could have been done holding a phone, but doing it with just wearing the glass and walking through, it did capture sort of a VIP eye view of the experience. And it was it wasn't just there were a few. We tried out the Google Glass in a few different sort of traditional news settings as well. And again, it worked. It was quite interesting, the results. So one of them was there was some people living in caves in Manchester, so homeless people living in caves, and the reporter wore the camera while she walked around these caves, and so you were able to see what it was like just to walk around these caves where people live in Stockport. And we also tried it out with court reporting, which was really interesting because one of our journalists covered a case of a man who went mad on an aeroplane and went berserk and tried to smash the window in the airplane, and he appeared in court. And our journalist went up to him afterwards, and he pleaded guilty and interviewed him. So it was an interesting experiment because the guy was happy to talk. So he did a full interview and said, "I want to apologise to all the people who were on the plane with me. I feel really ashamed of what I did." And I'm happy to speak to you about it. And then, but after we sort of finished, there was he obviously knew he was talking to a journalist from the MEN. But after we finished, we looked at the video and thought, did he actually know he was being filmed? Because obviously when you're wearing the camera, it's not that obvious. And it was a bit of a moral dilemma really for us, because you're obviously allowed to film people outside court without their consent. You're allowed to take their picture. And he did know that he was talking to a journalist, and he was happy to be quoted. But we weren't sure whether he knew we were filming him. And so what we actually did was we actually got in touch with him and said, did you know we were filming you? And are you happy to use the video? And he said he didn't know, but he was happy for us to use the video. So that was, it was quite interesting to see that using this technology in this way actually produces a new moral, enters into a new moral area, I suppose, that isn't really well defined. And the other things we used the wearable camera for was, the bottom right is a councillor in Manchester. You might not be able to see, but he's actually wearing the Google Glass. So we got him to wear the glass to a council meeting. So we were able to see what a council meeting looked like from the point of view of one of the councillors. So Google Glass has gone away a little bit, but I think wearable cameras in general is an interesting new technology that perhaps we will explore again later. And I think the other thing with video as well is that we've experimented with interactive video. So this was an example we did for our title in Derby, where they did eight people were being commemorated and plaques in the city centre, and people were able to choose which story they wanted to hear out of the eight and click on the video. So I think there's a lot of potential in that. That's an early sort of a new technology which is only really developing. But I think, again, that idea that people would be able to find the story that they want rather than us telling us the story that we want to tell them is interesting. And that I suppose that principle runs through a lot of the new technology that we're applying to regional journalism. Instead of us telling the story in 300 words, we're building widgets or gadgets that say to people, go in and find the story that's relevant to you. So we have a data journalism unit which is based in a few of our newsrooms, mainly in Manchester, but they produce quite a few of these widgets, so isolated communities. They produced a score for how connected a community is compared, looking at how close how many schools, libraries and other amenities are in the area. And they came up with a score. So you put in your postcode and it tells you how well connected your particular community is. And then just down to when there's a big vote in Parliament, we've got a widget there that we use quite a lot nowadays. And if you just think, how did my MP vote? Instead of having to go through a list of 650 MPs, you can just put in your constituency and it will tell you how your MP voted. And so that principle of allowing people to find the story that's relevant to them. And again, we see that time and again with data journalism, and we did a big project in Manchester on the Manchester Blitz. So plotting where people were killed in the Christmas Blitz. There was 2 nights of bombing in Manchester, and people were able to see where people died near them. And I think that is one of the big ways that we are able to use technology to tell stories, is by allowing people to find the story that they are interested in. And that sort of principle of personalisation, we developed down a few different avenues. We have looked at a few chatbots. This was one we built for the last election. Again, this was, we called this Emmeline. So Emmeline was a chatbot on Facebook for the Manchester Evening News, and she answered questions about voting. So it started off with being, are you registered to vote? And if not, this is where you can, pointing people into the direction of how you register to vote. And then people were able to ask information about who's standing, who are the candidates in my constituency, can you tell me a bit about them? What was the result in my constituency in the last election? Where is the nearest polling station? And all of that was geared towards people had to surrender their postcode to get that. But all of that was geared around personalising the information around the election for each, not just down to constituency level, but down to postcode level. And I think that was really interesting experiment, which we will develop again further. And one other thing we did on a similar vein is we did a chatbot that was based on an object. So there's a postbox in Manchester, the Arndale postbox, which was famous because it was right next to where the bomb went off in 1996, the IRA bomb, which devastated the Arndale shopping centre. but the Arndale postbox didn't have a scratch on it. So it was there's a famous picture of this scene as devastation, and that postbox just stood there with still gleaming red. And so this postbox, we had the idea that we would have people would be able to talk to it. In this case, it was a Twitter bot, but we overlaid data onto that location. And some of it was live data like the weather, but also sort of ambient data like crime figures. So people were able to ask, how dangerous is it around here? What are the crime rates? What are the latest crime rates? How they've gone up and down? And we also looked at probably the thing that got the most positive feedback for our test group was you're able to ask the Arndale postbox, where can I get a decent burger around here? So you're able to overlay recommendations for places to go and eat. So that was they were able to send that back to the website to get those recommendations. So I think it was interesting for us because, again, we're talking about a very particular point. You don't have to surrender your postcode either. Because you're talking to a postbox, we're assuming that you're nearby. And so it was a way of us giving people local information where we know more or less exactly where they are. One of the other sort of projects we've worked on, and this was funded by Google, so we've worked with some academics at the University of Central Lancashire on an Internet of Things project. So this received a big fund from the Google Digital News Innovation Fund. And we worked with readers, so we had a focus group in Manchester and Bristol asking people how they consume news and what sort of connected devices we could develop that people would perhaps consume regional news in the future. And it went in some pretty unexpected but interesting directions. So we ended up building 3 products, and these are the 3 here. The one at the back, which looks like a printer, is a printer. So we didn't expect that people would be interested in having printed news. But one of the things that came very strongly from the focus groups was that people felt they wanted a break from their devices, and particularly at night, they wanted to leave their phone downstairs, but they wanted to catch up on news. So they wanted to catch up on news stories that they'd seen during the day that they thought might be of interest. And so that printer allowed people to bookmark news stories and then print out a personalised news feed that they would then be able to read in bed without straining their eyes looking at a screen. So that was that. As I say, we didn't really expect that to be one of the things that people wanted, but that's the way it went. There was the one in the bottom left is a cone. It was called Cone Thing. So that was printer thing at the back. Cone Thing was a way of people personalising a text to speech. So people could get a news feed from the Manchester Evening News, get articles read out from the website. But what the Cone Thing would allow them to do would filter out types of news. So if they were thinking, I don't want to hear about anyone being stabbed or any crime, I only want to hear good news, they would be able to turn the Cone Thing to say, I only want upbeat, positive news, or I want all the news. Or it might another application might be, well, I've got my kids in the kitchen at the moment, and I don't want them to hear about anything, anyone being stabbed or any kids dying. So I want to filter out any stories about that or child sex crimes. Or if they're out of the room, I'll turn it back on again and I get the full news. So that was the idea behind that, and because it was a connected device, it was able to draw down the latest headlines. And the last one at the front was a social media monitoring device, which that was called, I don't know what it's called, but anyway, basically that was a device that sat on a news desk and monitored a Facebook feed. So it monitored the Manchester Evening News Facebook page. And whenever there was a strong reaction, either positive or negative, to a particular post, then it moved. So it moved on the desk, and it moved one way or another. And the idea behind that is that if you're a social media manager and you want to know when something quite big's happening on your Facebook page and you're not actually looking at it at that point in time, this would give you a really strong visual cue that there's something going on. You need to go in there and look at it. And we do find this sometimes with a Facebook page. There might be something that went on the site that people are really angry about. You know, there might be, this has happened before. An example was there was a festival, music festival, and the photographer had put in a load of pictures from the festival, and almost, well, unwittingly, he'd taken a picture of some people climbing over a fence, and people were angry because they thought the pictures weren't very flattering for the people climbing over the fence. So there was a lot that was building up into quite an extreme reaction in the Facebook comments, which obviously, if that had gone unchecked, then that could have, you know, built up and been a problem for the website. So the social media manager would have been alerted, and they could go in and take that picture down and deal with it. So those are the connected devices, and we are hoping to develop those further. We've applied for further funding, but those I think offered us an interesting insight into where news might move into connected devices. And there's another Google-funded project that we're working on now, which is called SenseMaker, where we're looking at how can we use sensors to gather data that will produce news. So this is very, very early stages at the moment. We just had our first meeting last week, but we're looking at one of the ideas that's come out, which I think is quite interesting, is that very often news desks get phone calls from people saying, I'm living in a rented accommodation and my home is not fit for human habitation. It's too damp, it's too noisy, it's too dirty, I think it's dangerous levels of gases in it. And if the journalists were able to give that person a sensor or a group of sensors they take home, then that could gather the data about their home, maybe the humidity or the temperature or the noise, and that would then arm those people in their sort of struggle to get improvements in their housing. So that was one idea that came out, and there was also a couple of ideas around homelessness and gathering data around the conditions for people who are living on the streets. But as I say, that's in the early stages, and we are looking at how journalists can shape that as well. So we're trying to get the journalists involved to talk about what would be useful for them. We are looking some interesting things, developments in AI. We have a couple of our news sites do a morning briefing for Alexa. We do it in Wales and in Liverpool. And what we found was that it's quite difficult to produce a professional quality broadcast, especially if it's been done by one person on their own in the newsroom who hasn't got the equipment or isn't trained. One of the things that Alexa does have is it has a Welsh accent built into the development tools. And so what we experimented with in Wales is using that. I'll see if this works. Does that work?
Welcome to the Wales Online News Briefing, and tonight, the news robot. The man is being erected on the suspicion that the following liquid contract outside the supermarket. Grant police reported between outside Sainsbury's supermarket in Lincolnshire on Dunbar at about 4 p.m. on Monday.
Right, so there's a built-in Welsh voice, so we can get a text-to-speech automated bulletin that is in a Welsh accent. And the surprising thing about that, well, maybe not surprising because we knew the quality wasn't great beforehand, is that people prefer the robot to the journalist. So people, and that's become across in the reviews. And we've got one in Liverpool as well, which again, we have some problems with quality. Unfortunately, there isn't a Liverpool accent in the development tools yet, but if there was, we'd probably try that out as well. But that is I think that's been really interesting. And the other big AI project we've been involved in is you may have heard of the Radar project, which was a press association experiment. Again, this was funded by Google, but they use natural language generation and AI to do local versions of data stories. So if you've got a spreadsheet that's got, say, the number of 5-year-olds who are not ready for school in every single local authority in the UK, they can build a template which will then draw out lines from that spreadsheet, press a button, and produce nearly 300 different versions of that story, 300 different stories, but they're all relevant to a particular area. So that was an experiment or a trial that we've been running for more or less a year now, and it's been really interesting, and it has actually produced lots of copy that's been used not only as filler in the newspapers, but been front page stories, and they've been generated from effectively by AI. So they are there is some journalism involved because the journalist has to write that template. But if you looked at that sort of those first three parts, they would be writing sort of a formula for the first word, I suppose. Then children in formula, could be starting school without basic school, so that would be your intro. And then you would have just, and then pull in that figure, children in, pull in this name. We're at a good level in the 20. So there is a sort of, there's text, there's journalism around it, but the different versions of the story are relevant to each area. So that's, I think, has been really interesting and has actually worked for a lot of titles. And I suppose the other place where AI and automation is completely changing the newsroom is in the lead generation, and we use data miner and other tools which actually tell journalists when a story is breaking. They can be told when a story is breaking in a patch that they cover or in an area that they cover, and they can set up the parameters on what alerts come through. And in many cases, many stories that you'll see on our websites will have originated from an automated tip from social media. So yeah, going back to the point I started on, really is the data, the amount of data that we have on our audience, and I think this is really changing journalism again. At the moment in our newsrooms, we're seeing lots of new jobs created, and different career structures as well, and different newsroom structures. And I think with the amount of data that we've got about our audience, we know in very, very minute detail what stories they read, what they go on to read, where they've come from. And I suppose we've seen the manifestation of that has been things like fake news and content farms and clickbait. But I think it's also given. It opens up really interesting questions about how journalists are sort of judged, I suppose, and how journalists work within a newsroom, because newsroom managers will have very detailed data about how many stories each journalist has written and how many people have read those stories. And so by that you can see, I suppose you can get one idea is how prolific someone is, but also you can see actually that person might write a fraction of stories of the other person, but get a far bigger audience. And it's what you do with that information, I suppose. What you do with that data, and how you manage a group of journalists. So, whether you use it to help people build a bigger audience for the stories that they're doing, or cover different stories. And I think that's the interesting things that that our newsroom managers are grappling with now. But I think the important thing is that many people will see that sort of slide and see that idea and think, well, that's what leads to clickbait. And I saw this tweet earlier on today which made me smile, and I think clickbait has become, from being tricking people into reading a story to get the programmatic revenue, clickbait has become any story you disagree with, basically. And we get that. I suppose the fear is that can lead, that's what it will lead to if you're only going for the stories that get the biggest audience. But I think that what we're trying to do, and I think we're succeeding, is to use that data to see what we can do to build an audience around the journalism that we, and I think our audiences and probably everyone here, thinks is the sort of journalism we should be doing. How can we build a bigger audience for the journalism that matters and the journalism that people think is worth fighting for, I suppose. And I think that we are seeing that. These are all headlines on the Chronicle today. People often accuse journalists at the Chronicle and other sites of just chasing the audience, but these are all really important stories, and they are stories that are prominent on the website. You know, these are stories that are being covered. It's not a case of just chasing after the biggest audience. But the gratifying thing is that because we're getting better at learning how to pitch stories and also building audiences around certain topics, these stories are getting the biggest audience. So that story was the top story when I had a quick look earlier on this morning. The most read news stories on the Chronicle website was a story about benefits and benefits tests being cut, which is very much within the remit of what I think most people will think is what the Chronicle should be covering. So the data about the audience doesn't have to lead to dumbing down or clickbait. It can and should and is leading to us covering those stories, those local stories better and reaching a bigger audience. So that's all from me. But happy to answer questions.
You've been listening to JLab, a podcast brought to you by the Civic Journalism Lab in association with Newcastle University and BBC North East and Cumbria. I'm Ian Wiley. Thanks for listening.